What's the hardest thing about forgiveness for you? What makes it easier for you to forgive somebody? And what makes it really hard to forgive somebody? When you think about forgiveness, do you think the capacity to forgive makes you strong and resilient and compassionate? Or do you have this idea that forgiveness has this kind of weakness to it where you're being a pushover or a doormat in somebody or letting somebody off the hook too easily? Is there anything you need to forgive yourself for? Hi, this is Sara Russell. I'm a relationship coach, dancer, and Taoist. In every episode, I'll be talking about psychedelics, well-being, and the human experience, and this one is on how to forgive. So I was at Esalen taking a workshop from Fred Luskin, and I'm sitting in this tent by the ocean, and all of a sudden this older man walks in, and he's a little stooped over, and he's got kind of the shuffling walk, and he's walking up to the stage. He's not looking at the audience at all. He has this scowl on his face, and he's slowly making his way up to the platform. And then he turns to us, the audience, and he's scowling at us. He has this furrowed brow, his lips are curled, and he's looking at us, and he says in this kind of cantankerous voice, "Do you think your emotions are the most important thing? Do you think how you feel is the most important thing?" And then his whole face softens, the corners of his eyes start to crinkle, his mouth starts to turn up, and he goes, "The most important thing is forgiveness." And he goes into this speech about how important forgiveness is, not just for other people and for culture and humanity and these kind of ideals that we have around forgiveness, what forgiveness is, but also how healing forgiveness is for ourselves. And let's talk about what we mean when we say forgiveness, because I think there's a misconception about it, what it means to forgive. So there's this quote that's been attributed to a bunch of different people, so I'm not sure exactly who it is, but it's, "Forgiveness is giving up all hope for a better past." Giving up all hope for a better past. That's not saying forgiveness is condoning what happened in the past. It's not saying you need to reconcile with whatever person harmed you in the past. But forgiveness is this idea of how do we let go so that we can move on. And I have Fred's book here. It's Forgive for Love. And I'm going to read what Fred Luskin says forgiveness is. What is forgiveness? Oh, and anytime he has this as a very romantic partnership, like how to forgive your partner kind of book. So I'm going to change it. Anytime it says partner, I'm going to say something like someone, so that this is a little bit more inclusive for all relationships. Forgiveness is for you and not someone else. Forgiveness is taking back your power from being wounded. Forgiveness is taking responsibility for how you feel now. Forgiveness is about healing and not about someone else's actions. Forgiveness is a trainable skill, just like learning to throw a baseball. Y'all know I love things with repetition and practice. Forgiveness helps you get control over your feelings today. Forgiveness can improve your mental and physical health. Forgiveness is a choice you make. Everyone can learn to forgive. Forgiveness is making peace when you did not get what you wanted. Forgiveness is acknowledging the hurt. And let's talk about what forgiveness is not. So I talked about this a little bit. Forgiveness is not condoning past harm. It's not saying what somebody did is okay. Just because we are trying to figure out a way to move on or let go doesn't mean we're trying to accept a behavior that for us was intolerable or harmful or hurtful in some way. And so Fred also has a sweet list on what forgiveness is not. Forgiveness is not condoning someone's unkindness. Forgiveness is not forgetting that something painful happened. Forgiveness is not excusing poor behavior. Forgiveness does not have to be an otherworldly or religious experience. Forgiveness does not require you to reconcile with someone else. Forgiveness does not ask you to give up having painful feelings. So this is about still feeling what you feel. This is about still acknowledging what's been done. But forgiveness is a way to be able to hold it in your body in a way that works better for you. So this is really about you in a lot of ways, right? So when we talk about forgiveness not being the same as reconciliation, reconciliation is this idea that we are going to move forward together in some way. And I don't know if you want to move, like if you're offering forgiveness or you're trying to receive forgiveness, that doesn't necessarily mean that you want to move forward together, right? Forgiveness isn't about moving forward together necessarily so much as it is about letting go and moving on from something in some way. And reconciliation and like that's great. Like I love if that's an option. So I'm not saying like never reconcile like within the forgiveness process. I'm just saying it's not mandated for this. And then forgiveness is also this idea of, oh, forgive and forget. With forgiveness, we don't actually want to forget. We want to remember, because that remembering is going to help us with our choices in the future, because we might decide to do something different in the future. So for instance, if you extended too much trust towards somebody, you might need to extend less trust to people in the future unless they've hit certain benchmarks where you know that somebody is trustworthy. So we want to remember. And not a remembering in a way we're reliving trauma. Reliving trauma just re-traumatizes us, so we don't need to dwell in the past in order to remember. It's just holding this awareness of what could potentially be different in the future. Forgiveness also doesn't mean that there's no accountability. And as an abolitionist, the idea of justice, like that gets a little sticky, and I can get into that in future podcasts. But I'm still all for accountability and this idea that within forgiveness, there may be some process of apologizing, but, I talked about this on my How to Apologize podcast. Sometimes the words "I'm sorry" aren't enough, and there needs to be some kind of repair and some kind of reparations. And so figuring out what the accountability process is. So this doesn't mean that somebody doesn't need to be accountable just because you forgave them, right? There can still be a whole accountability process that we can go through. And before we go any farther, I'm talking about forgiveness. And so often when I'm talking about these concepts, I'm leaning towards a model that is hoping for cooperation, communication, and in general, a lack of abuse. And so even Fred Luskin, who's saying forgiveness is the most important thing and like your feelings aren't the most important thing, he's saying that a little cheekily, because obviously he says this, and I really want to emphasize this, that if abuse is happening, has happened, and there hasn't been accountability or repair, or the abuse is continuing in some way, the most important thing is actually getting to safety. And so I really want to emphasize, if there's abuse, safety is the most important thing. Making sure the person who's being harmed is getting to safety in some way. So we're not going to move towards forgiveness. We're not going to work towards letting go of our feelings and moving on and forgiving ourselves and forgiving the other person. We're getting to safety first. So I do want to emphasize that. So why do we forgive? We forgive because ruminating on the past, obsessing over what happened to us, is actually really stressful. It's really depleting. It's really heavy. And like I said, it's reliving this trauma. So we're re-traumatizing ourselves. Going back into the past and remembering all of the awful things that happened, our body doesn't necessarily know that it's not happening to us again, because we might be experiencing the same emotions. We might have the same tension in our body. We might be kicking off the same chemical response in some way. And so constantly reliving what was can actually be really detrimental. And again, I'm not saying we completely ignore it either. So this is a little bit of like finding that particular balance, like how much awareness do we bring without actually becoming obsessive and ruminating on the past. So it's a way for us to stop reliving our pain. Resentment also takes up a tremendous amount of space and energy in the body. If you've ever been caught in a looping thought or been stuck in some kind of remembering that's really hard for you, like you don't have energy, right? You get really heavy, you get really tired, you get really demoralized. There's hopelessness, there's helplessness. And so it becomes really hard to have the kind of present moment we want if we're really holding on to the past. Another reason why we forgive is to learn from our experiences. Oh, in that particular situation, I'm analyzing it. This is what happened. In the future, this is how I would like it to be different. These are the different choices I would like to make. These are the people that I want to surround myself with. So there can be some kind of growth from looking at the past and then allowing it to change what's happening in the present and the future. Another reason we forgive is to grieve. It's to actually turn towards our feelings instead of bouncing away from them, instead of burying them somewhere deep inside us where they can just, fester and rot and root down. It's to be able to give yourself a big enough container in order to feel resentment and anger and grief and despair and sadness and hurt and pain, so that your body actually has a way to move those things through you somatically, so they can start to shift, so they can start to integrate in some way. So we're not trying to avoid our feelings. So forgiveness isn't about avoiding our suffering. It's not about stopping the suffering. It's about creating enough space in our bodies that we actually have room for the suffering so that we can start to shift it and also hold it. Physiologically, not forgiving also has an impact on your health. So we see spikes in blood pressure. It has an impact on your cardiovascular health. You hold muscle tension, and the list goes on and on about what happens when we hold on to resentment, when we hold on to anger, when we don't let ourselves move on or process in some way. It can have this really unhealthy impact on our physical well-being. So we forgive in order to help our mental, our emotional, and our physical health. And the things that we need to forgive people for, they may be minor, they may be small, they may be slight irritations, like that. I think of the old Aesop's fable with the lion with the thorn in its paw. It might just be this, it's not comfortable. But sometimes the things surrounding forgiveness are overwhelming and heavy and really hard to let go of. And if something is particularly hard to let go of, again, holding forgiveness in this framework, in this context, that forgiveness isn't condoning and it's not reconciliation, it's this idea of letting go. If we're having a particularly hard time of letting go, there may be a self-forgiveness piece in all of this, something that you haven't forgiven yourself for. Now, this may be something that you didn't know. This may be a choice that you later regret, information that you didn't have, a skill set that you didn't have. But part of the reason we blame ourselves in those moments is it's a move to have power over our powerlessness. Because here's the thing, if we did something wrong or we did something bad, like we made a bad choice, then that would give us some control over what happened to us, right? If I just chosen something else, if I hadn't made a bad decision, if I'd been more thoughtful or more conscientious in that moment, if I had listened to my intuition in that moment, then I wouldn't have put myself in that situation. And that's putting a tremendous amount of personal responsibility on yourself, again, for something you didn't know, because if you knew it was going to happen, you probably wouldn't have done it. Or if you knew it was going to happen, but you didn't have the tools or skills or resources or support to not do that thing or to do the thing, you would have done it or you would have not done it, right? If you had actually had access to that as a choice. So this idea of putting it on yourself is actually a way for you to try to shame yourself as a way to try to protect yourself from your powerlessness. So you may need to forgive yourself for the fact that you didn't actually have control of that situation. And all of the going back into the past and trying to solve it in the past that you're doing so as a way to try to protect yourself in the present or in the future, that's you trying to take responsibility for somebody else's bad behavior. This idea that you are somehow responsible for protecting yourself from other people harming you, that feels like a really life-draining cosmology to me, rather than other people are responsible for not hurting people. And I know we don't live in a culture where that's actually available, so there's some idealism in that, but it's also the world that I'm working to create. And so this idea that you are responsible for people not hurting you, people are responsible for not hurting you. You're not responsible for that. You're responsible for not hurting others. So this idea that you need to constantly be on guard and vigilant and analyzing all of your actions as a way to keep you safe. First of all, it's not realistic. You can do all of the Mad Eye Moody style constant vigilance, Boy Scouts always be prepared that you want, and hurt and harm is still going to happen. There may also be a self-forgiveness piece if you didn't act in alignment with your best self or your highest values or your morality or your ethics. So we're human and we mess up and we make mistakes and we hurt other people. And sometimes we do it with awareness and sometimes we do it unintentionally. But the thing is we're going to hurt each other. And obviously there are varying degrees of that. And again, I'm not trying to excuse abuse or incredible harm, but also recognizing that we're just different. We're in different bodies and we have different wants and we have different needs and different skill sets. And we were raised with different values and we have access to different resources. And so hurt is going to happen. And so have you forgiven yourself for the hurt that you've done to other people? And part of being able to forgive yourself is knowing what your accountability process is, right? So if you do hurt somebody, what are the steps that you take in order to have accountability, in order to repair? And while you're doing that, I want to make sure that in your accountability process, in your repair process, that's actually for the person that was harmed in some way. So this isn't about you forcing somebody else to forgive you as a way to relieve your guilt, because first of all, I just don't think that works. I don't think that's very effective. But also you could potentially be causing more harm to the other person if you're trying to force them to go through a forgiveness process that they're not actually ready to go through yet. So for forgiving yourself, this isn't about how you can force somebody else to forgive you so you can forgive yourself. This is about you knowing what your accountability process is so you can start taking those steps in order to make amends for whatever it was that you did. So when you're having, like through your accountability process, and I emphasize this all the time, I will keep saying it, I'm going to say it again right now, that you're really recognizing the impact of your actions rather the intention of your actions. So whatever you intended, however good your intentions were or unconscious your intentions were, I really want you to be able to focus on what the impact was. So we're really always turning towards the person that experienced harm in some way and asking them, what do they need? Whether that's you, whether that's somebody else, whether that's multiple people involved, and holding the complexity of that. And again, how there may be differences in what's perceived versus what was experienced. In all of this forgiveness, whether you're forgiving yourself, whether you're forgiving somebody else, whether you want somebody else to forgive you, there's this piece of accepting the unacceptable, where something happened that we didn't want to happen, but accepting that it did, that that's the what is, that that's what actually happened, rather than trying to reframe it by the way you analyze it in the past, or, again, focusing on your intention rather than your impact, really being able to sit with accepting the unacceptable. And that's a hard thing, because accepting the unacceptable, it doesn't feel good. Like, that doesn't necessarily make us feel better, but what it does is it gives us a little bit of breath. I think about Thich Nhat Hanh, this idea that if you're experiencing anger and you accept the fact that you're experiencing the anger, that accepting what is, it creates like this little bit of space around your body where you can breathe into it just a little bit more. So it's still painful. It still hurts. There may still be anger. There may still be things that need to change and repair that needs to happen. But you've given yourself a little bit more room in which to do that. And there's this idea in Buddhism of the two darts. And the first dart is the experience, whatever the painful experience was, whatever the harm or the hurt or the anger or the sadness or frustration. And that first dart is painful enough. The what is, the accepting the unacceptable, is painful enough. But then the second dart that comes on in, the second wounding, is the story we tell about the first dart, the story we tell about what was happening. And that second dart can have a lot of life-draining, toxic, limiting beliefs in it that make the initial experience even more painful than it already was. And that second dart is completely unnecessary. So the original wound, the pain, is enough without causing yourself future pain, further pain, by ruminating and obsessing and reliving the trauma in that moment. It sucked enough the first time. You don't need to keep going through it. And so accepting the unacceptable is accepting what is without going into then this storytelling that makes it even worse. If that stickiness around forgiveness is around the self-forgiveness piece, there are some things that are common that we may need to forgive ourselves for. So common things that we need to forgive ourselves for include extending too much trust. And I talked about this a little bit earlier in the podcast, right? And an example of this is, for instance, you're in new relationship energy, right? That first chemical rush of bonding when you're falling in love with somebody and there's this new relationship and there's all this excitement and all of your biology is going, you should get close to this person. It's really easy to extend a lot of trust in new relationship energy. But do you actually know that person well enough to give them all of the trust, like all of your hormones and chemicals are saying you should give that person? Because we know when we're in a new relationship, we're putting our best selves forward, right? Dan Savage has this line from way back when he says that whoever you're pretending to be in those first 6 months of the relationship, if you end up staying with that person, it's your job to try to become that person for the rest of the relationship. So whoever you were trying to be, like, it's your job to try to figure out how to actually be that person. Again, like tongue in cheek with that, but also valid. And so anyways, it's really easy to extend too much trust. And then when that person that you're in new relationship energy with decides they don't want to keep dating you, or they decide that they don't want to continue whatever the relationship is, right? Or you get ghosted or something like that. There can be this incredible drop into shame of, oh, like I was so stupid to trust this person. Like, why did I do that? I saw all these signs. So you may need to forgive yourself for extending too much trust early on in a relationship. And again, because like there's larger context, like that's what our bodies are trying to get us to do for procreation and the fact that we're social creatures and we all want to be gathered around the campfire together. And anyways, I digress. The other thing that you may need to forgive yourself for is if you were the untrustworthy one. Maybe you withheld information or kept a secret or broke your word in some way. And so again, like some amount of accountability is going to be appropriate in these situations, but is shame the best motivator in order for you to hold yourself accountable? Or do you need to actually like turn towards yourself with compassion and go, yeah, I didn't show up the way I wish I showed up. And I want to build a skill set or a capacity in order to do something different in the future. So forgiving yourself for trusting too much or forgiving yourself for having an untrustworthy moment. Something else we may need to forgive ourselves for is not protecting ourselves. So again, we have all of these cultural injunctions around where we should be, with whom, when, and it's like really complicated, right? Because we want to be able to live our lives. We want to be able to be out in the world. And at the same time, we're going like, oh, is this a good choice that I'm making? Should I have made a different choice? So we may need to forgive ourselves if we felt like there was a different move we could have made to protect ourselves better. And I don't want to victim blame in this. Like, this is not about you shouldn't have gone there because you should have known better. I want us to have a world where it is safe for us to be out in the world because people aren't dominating us and oppressing us and abusing us. That's the world I want. It's not the world we're in right now. But sometimes there's a move that we could have made in order to remove ourselves from a situation. So for instance, let's say you're in the middle of a fight and somebody starts name calling and you don't move your body away from that. Like there may be some forgiveness for the fact that you had a freeze response in that moment because that's your survival mechanism. And then again, on the flip side, there's also this not protecting somebody else. So this can happen when a loved one gets an illness and we are trying to do everything we can for their health care. But like we can't actually control, what the progression of that illness or what the outcome of that illness is. This may also be like that kind of bystander mode that happens, that when something's happening in our environment and there's lots of bystanders, we go, oh, somebody else is going to call 911 or somebody else is going to intervene in this moment. And we kind of just do nothing because we assume somebody else is going to do it. And so we may need to forgive ourselves, again, for not acting in a moment when we wish we would have stood up for somebody or defended somebody or rushed to the rescue in some way. So there may be a self-forgiveness piece around that. And again, with all of these, there's a skill building where we can make a different choice in the future as well. And having compassion for yourself and forgiving yourself that you might not be where you want to be yet. We may also need to forgive ourselves for not holding our boundaries. And there are all kinds of reasons why we don't hold our boundaries. First of all, is it safe to hold a boundary, or are we going to be persecuted or harmed in some way for holding our boundary? So do we give up our boundary as a self-protection mechanism? Do we even know what our boundaries are? It can be really confusing and conflicting, like what we think our boundary should be versus what somebody else is telling us our boundary should be. And then actually having an embodied practice where we can regularly enact our boundary, even in a tough situation where it's challenging to hold our boundary, or when a loved one really doesn't want us to hold that boundary, and then we have to enact a boundary while still trying to stay in connection with somebody else, right? So there may be this forgiveness piece around holding a boundary. Something else that you may need to forgive yourself for, that we all might need to forgive ourselves for, is staying in a relationship too long. And, I just recorded a podcast where I talk about how to break up. And in it, I talk about we're not taught how to leave, and often what happens is we leave when there's no good left, or when there's nothing left, like when all of the fires in our heart are out. We're not taught how to leave when there's just a mismatch, or the differences are creating a gap that's too big between us and we can't cross, there's like no bridge across that gap, or like it's one of those like really rickety ones like Indiana Jones style where you're going to fall into the crocodiles. Like it's not enough, but we're still clinging desperately to it, clinging desperately to the relationship because we're just hoping something's going to shift. And, sometimes somebody doesn't want us to leave. And so we stay because we're like, oh, like this other person really needs me, or like this other person isn't going to be okay without me. And so then we end up self-sacrificing in order to caretake for that other person. And so we may need to forgive ourselves when we knew we needed to leave a particular relationship and we stayed longer for whatever reason that was. Okay, so now if we're trying to forgive ourselves, one of the things that we may need to do, that I think it's really important to do, is to actually turn towards our fear, right? Turn towards all of those negative feelings, because the fear may be providing us with a certain sense of safety or security that we're clinging to. And in Skills for Change, we talk about holding your boundary in your story. So for instance, if somebody did you harm, and you are clinging to a story that they are a toxic person or they're the villain in your story, and you're, of course, we all want to be the hero of our own narrative. But if we can make the other person bad in some way, sometimes we do that as this way to figure out how to hold our boundary, right? Like we only know how to hold our boundary if we're telling this really awful story about this other person. This person is toxic, which means I'm justified in removing myself from this relationship, and I have a good reason to not ever talk to that person again or to ignore that person in some way because they're toxic, right? Versus you being able to just have a boundary like, hey, you didn't meet my minimum standard. You're not treating me the way that I want to be treated. And I can actually remove myself. I can take space. I can limit how much trust I'm extending to you, how much intimacy you receive from me, how much connection I'm offering, how much time and energy and contact, because it didn't meet my standard, versus having to make the other person bad in some way, right? So it's this idea of your actions didn't work for me. You're not doing the things that I need you to do in order for me to continue to stay in relationship with you. That's really different than going, that person is completely awful, and so I'm not willing to deal with awful people, right? So holding the boundary in the story rather than holding your boundary and your values, and being able to do that from a place of complexity rather than this kind of dualistic, I'm good, you're bad, I'm right, you're wrong, versus this was wrong for me, even though it seemed like it was right for you in the moment, and that's just a mismatch that doesn't work for me. The other thing is turning towards our fears about ourselves, right? This idea that if we don't forgive ourselves or we don't accept forgiveness from somebody else, that the shame that we feel for the behavior that we did is going to somehow motivate us to never do this again, right? So we see this with addiction. We see this with infidelity. This idea of like, oh, if I just shame myself enough, then I won't ever make that choice and that decision again. But we know that shame is incredibly draining for the energy in the body. And so when that moment comes up again, if you've just worn yourself out with shame, are you actually going to have enough energy to make a different decision in that moment? And if you've just been shaming yourself and you haven't actually like analyzed and like brought awareness to like, okay, why did I make that choice? And what's the choice that I want to make in the future? Like if you haven't done that analysis, how are you not going to make the same choice in the future? Like we have this idea that just because we have enough willpower, we won't do the thing again. But in order to not do the thing again, you need awareness. You need to have a new practice. You need to have a lot of repetitions of embodying that new state in your body so that new choice is actually like something you can pick up in the moment, rather than you just going back to the default thing that you did the last time. So again, like really being able to hold your fears. What are you afraid of that's within you, and the choices that you make and the decisions that you make and the things that you feel like you want to build a new capacity around, or these weaknesses that you feel like you want to strengthen in some way. So really being able to turn towards that rather than just like, yeah, I'm a terrible human being and I completely suck, and like by telling myself I suck enough, then maybe like I won't suck the next time that situation comes up. I just don't think that's the way to go about this. So one of the things that we can do is build more self-trust. And as we're building self-trust, we want to build self-trust and our capacity to hold our boundaries, to know what it is that we want, to be able to move our bodies away from the things that we don't want. So building self-trust in the fact that we have a boundary and we know how to hold it. Also building self-trust and our capacity to take care of ourselves. This idea that if harm befalls us, this is the way that I'm going to be sweet to myself. This is the way that I need to resource myself. These are all the things that I'm going to do in order to take care of myself. So building self-trust that when something happens to you, you know how to recover from it. And that recovery is really important because it builds this sense of resiliency, right? This idea that, okay, harm's going to happen. And when harm happens, I've got this. I know how to take care of myself through all of this. So one of the ways that we can build self-trust also is that when we experience harm or when we do harm, that we know how to ask for help and how to take accountability, right? So I talked about this earlier, knowing what your accountability process is when you do harm, and also when you've experienced harm, trusting yourself to ask for help, because we have this toxic individualism in the culture where we think that it's strong in order to be able to figure something out by ourselves. This idea that we should be able to manage it by ourselves, and that's strength, that's being resilient, that's being resourced. And again, we're social creatures. We need each other. So do you trust yourself to actually ask for help and support when you need it rather than just suffer by yourself? Because in order to get the care that you need, in order to get the healing that you need, in order to make the changes that you need, that's going to be a hell of a lot easier if you've got people who have your back and are supporting you rather than trying to do it by yourself. That is a lengthy process that I don't feel has a lot of sustainable success in it. So, just because we forgive somebody doesn't mean we condone the action. It doesn't mean we want a relationship with them moving forward. Some people aren't going to have the motivation in order to do an accountability process. Some people are going to want to do an accountability process, but aren't going to have the skill set or the capacity to do that. You get to decide, where in that you need to cultivate a skill set, right? Where you need to practice forgiving yourself, where you need to accept forgiveness from somebody else because you trust yourself to hold your boundary, getting really clear on what your accountability process is when you hurt somebody, the accountability process that you need from somebody else. Like, is there a repair journey that is available to bring you to forgiveness for somebody else? So getting really clear on what you need. Getting really clear on what you need in order to forgive yourself, and getting really clear on what you need in order to forgive somebody else if that's available. And to end, I will read this quote from Khaled Hosseini from The Kite Runner. And this is from a passage later in the book. I wondered if that was how forgiveness budded, not with the fanfare of epiphany, but with pain gathering its things, packing up, and slipping away unannounced in the middle of the night. Thanks for listening. For more information, you can find me on Instagram at BeTheRadicalWay, and go to trendswithbenefits.com for all of our written work on psychedelics, well-being, and the human experience.